Well, hey there, ninth graders. Welcome to this reading. I would like you to follow along. So if you could please pull up Marine Corps issue on my website. I'll pause right now for you to do that. Okay, first off, I want you to look at focus your reading. It's on the first page, and it says here a flashback is an account of a conversation, an episode, or an event that happened before the beginning of the story. So oftentimes when you have a flashback in a story, the narrator or a character in there will be in present time and they'll talk about something that has happened in the past. I'm sure you've read about that in a story before, or definitely have seen it used in a movie. It's often used in movies. Now, pop over to build background here. It says a cruel struggle. The war between North Vietnam and South Vietnam lasted from 1957 to 1975. Though U.S. troops fought in it alongside South Vietnamese troops only from 1965 to 1973. There was some U.S. involvement prior to 65. If you're curious about that, look it up. It says this war is particularly notable for being the first one in which the United States, ever failed in its mission. In this case, to prevent a communist takeover of South Vietnam. Currently, to this day, Vietnam is a communist country, and there isn't a North and a South. It's just Vietnam. The effects of this war were devastating for many soldiers and their families. The fighting took the lives of about 58,000 Americans and left 365,000 wounded. Many U.S. servicemen, especially the wounded and the hundreds who had been held prisoner by the North Vietnamese, returned from the war with both physical and psychological scars. So this book, this story is a little tough, but it will address some of the things that were set up in the build background. So let's take a look at this Marine Corps issue by David McLean. My father used to keep 3 wooden locker boxes stacked in the tool shed behind our garage. This was at our house in Southern Illinois, where I grew up. The boxes, big heavy chests with an iron handle on each end, were fatigue green, but had splintered in places. Chips of paint and wood had broken off during the miles of travel, and a shiny splayed pine showed underneath. Each box was each box was padlocked with an oily bronze lock, the keys to which my father kept on his key ring, along with his house keys and car keys. I knew that because I saw him open the top box once when a friend came to visit. My father lifted the lid of the top chest and then a tray within and pulled out an album or a yearbook of some kind, something to do with the war. The visitor was an old Marine Corps buddy, still active and in uniform. They laughed over photographs and drank whiskey, a whole bottle. I crouched in the hallway around the corner from the kitchen and listened as long as I dared. I don't remember much of the talk, names and places I had never heard of, but I do recall the man calling my father Gunny. And I commented on his hand and commenting on his hands. My father had damaged hands. Look at your hands, Gunny. Look at them. And I think they cried, or maybe it's just drunken giggles. I don't know. That was the only time I ever saw my father drink. That was 1974. I was 10 years old. So right off the bat, this is a flashback. The guy's looking back to his past and back to what he knew about his father's military activity. At this point, we only knew that he had damaged hands and that he was gunny. And if you look at that, it says gunny is a nickname for a gunnery sergeant in U.S. Marine Corps. Always check the notes in a story. You see that one's marked number 1. It just helps add understanding and makes the story a little bit more enjoyable. So let's continue. That was when our narrator, who his name is Charles, we'll find that out soon. He was 10 then. My original name was Charles Michael. And for the first 10 months of my life, my mother tells me I was called Charlie. I had no father then, that is. He had never seen me. But when he returned from Vietnam, for the first time, in early 1965, within a week, he began the legal proceedings to change my name. Soon after, I was Jonathan Allen. I still am. I learned all this from my mother when I was 20 and needed my birth certificate for a passport application. My father was 3 months dead then when my mother explained to me about Charlie and how I had been renamed for a dead corporal from a small town in Georgia. And once again, if you're looking at the notes, you will see that Charlie was the nickname given to the North Vietnamese. And so when U.S. soldiers were fighting in Vietnam, they called the enemy Charlie. And so for Dad to come back from Vietnam and find his kid was named the same name as the enemy, that's why Charlie went to Jonathan Allen. I see my father most often in two ways: playing handball, or years later, sitting on the edge of our elevated garden, black ashes from a distant fire falling lightly like snow around him. As I said, my father had damaged hands, a degenerative arthritis, we were told. They were large, leprous hands, thick with scar tissue and slightly curled. He could neither make a fist nor straighten them completely. Normally, they hung limp at his sides or were stashed in his pockets. To grip things, he had to use a lot of wrist movement, giving him a grotesque bird on a perch appearance. He rarely touched anyone with them, though he did hit me once. A well-deserved blow, I know now, and knew even then in a vague way of an innocent. My older brother Joe and I would watch him from the walkway above and behind the handball courts while our mother waited outside. I was 6 years old, but I can still see him clearly, playing alone as always. He wears olive green shorts, plain white canvas shoes, and long white socks, a gray sweatshirt, the neck ripped loose down the front, and a fatigue green headband wrapped tightly around his bony forehead. Black thinning hair, dipped in gray, rises up like tufts of crabgrass around the headband. He wears dirty white leather gloves. He swings at the hard black ball forcefully as though he held paddles of thick oak. I hear the amplified slap of his hand and then a huge explosion booming through the court as the ball ricochets back. He runs after it, catches up to it, and slaps it again, driving it powerfully into the corner. His tall, thin figure jerks across the court and off the wall. His slaps alternating with the hollow explosion, his shoes squeaking, his controlled breath bursting out as he tries, it seems to me, to break the ball or maybe rid himself of it forever. But it always returns somehow, even dribbling to the center of the court. Exhausted, he sits against the wall, breathing heavily, his court gone suddenly quiet, though the booming echoes from nearby courts can still be heard. He watches the ball bounce off its final wall, and then slowly roll to a stop. I watch it with him until it again becomes an inert black ball on the wooden floor. I said that my father had once hit me. It was at our second meeting. The first had been on that 6-month home leave when he changed my name. I remember nothing of that, of course. I do remember his second return home, though, when I was 5 years old. To my new conscience, Daddy was simply a figure in a photograph, a steely, strong-looking man in dress blues. I remember the disjunction I'd felt upon seeing him for the first time, how I had trouble believing that this man was the same man as in the photograph. He was thin and gaunt and silent, with deeper eyes and a higher forehead than I had expected to see. He looked at me strangely. He hadn't seen me grow up. I could have been any child, an adopted son, were it not my resemblance to him. What I learned shortly after the first real meeting was the necessity of being a noisy child. Noise alerted him to my presence and prevented him from being surprised and reacting on instinct. I began to knock on walls and shuffle my feet or sing to myself as I walked through the house. I discovered this survival technique one Saturday morning shortly after his return. I had awakened early and had rolled off the lower bunk, my blanket under my arms, a sleepy animal child going to look for his mother. I walked down the hall and into the living room where my father sat reading. He had not heard me come in. I wanted to play a game. I crept around at the end table near his chair, suppressing a giggle, and watched him for a minute. I looked at the back of his head, smelled his sharp aftershave smell, stared freely for the first time at his gnarled left hand holding the book in the rolled wrist way. And then I leaped out from the table and shouted, "Boo!" I saw a white flash. I was airborne, backwards, on my shoulders and over my head. I landed hard on my face and knees, bleeding from the nose and mouth. I looked up and saw him crouched and rigid, eyes on fire, palms flat, fingers as stiff as he could make them. Then he melted. right there before me, his body slumping down like warm wax. And he began shouting and crying, "Diane, come get this child away from me." He wouldn't look at me. His hands were in his pockets. He walked out of the house and into the backyard. I didn't see him again until breakfast the following morning. My mother arrived and swooped me into her arms. Only then did I begin to cry. So on Jonathan Allen's second meeting with Dad, he decides to sneak up on him and play a joke. But if you have been in war before, where a twig breaking, any sound could mean an imminent death, you put on alert. You're set up to react. And unfortunately for Jonathan Allen, Dad was having a hard time letting go of that mindset. And so when he got snuck up on, he just reacted. And obviously Dad felt really ashamed by this. He did not feel comfortable with his reaction, which is why he disappeared for a day. So Jonathan Allen figured out after that you make noise to let Dad know you're coming ahead of time. You don't sneak up on the guy. My mother's life intrigues me. Her strength, well hidden when I was younger, becomes obvious upon reflection. I spent a lot of time reading about the Marine Corps and Vietnam. It as a way of knowing my father, and yet I often find my mother in the books. I cannot read of Quai Son or Da Nang without imagining my mother at home with 2 children under the age of 7 and a husband across the world fighting a war, what I think of as a stupid war at that. She has never spoken about that time, not even about the 4 continuous years of my father's absence. When my grandmother told me she would spend at least 2 hours every night weeping alone. The children already asleep, and when she could hardly sleep herself. Even after my father's return, tension and distance continued for some time. Our family was different from others. I can best describe it as being composed of opposing camps, not camps at war with each other, but survival camps. My mother and I in one, my father and Joe in the other. We had no open animosity towards each other, only distance. My father was in the Marine Corps for 17 years before beginning his second career in the offices of the Stone City Steel Mill. He was a decorated soldier, a career man forced to retire disabled because of his hands. He had been a drill instructor, a fact that always widens the eyes of those I tell. I can see them reassessing me as soon as I say it. Marine Corps drill instructor. And they look at me in a shifted way that is hard to define. A pity, perhaps, sometimes a fear. I do have a temper comparable to my father's, which usually shows itself in short, explosive bursts of expletives that roll out of my mouth naturally as if I were a polyglot switching tongues. So apparently Jonathan Allen has a temper too, and he expresses it with a series of swear words. Loud. The violence is verbal only, though I can still see my father if I make the effort at my brother's throat. Joe had been caught smoking in the garage a second time. He is 14 and has been warned. He's pinned to the wall of the garage by my father's crooked paw, his feet dangling, toes groping for the solid ground as though he will fall upward and off the earth if he can't find a grip. His eyes are wide and swollen with tears. My father's voice is a slow burn, his nostrils wide. He finishes speaking, drops Joe to the concrete floor and strides quickly away. Despite my father's years of service, our house was devoid of memorabilia. A visitor would have no idea about my father's military career were it not evident in his walk and his demeanor. Civilians might even miss those clues. Our house was not a family mansion like other houses. We had few family photographs, and the decor consists chiefly of landscape paintings and small ceramic collectibles, dolls and Norman Rockwell scenes, and wooden elephants from around the world. At 16, I saw the movie Apocalypse Now. Have any of you seen it? Actually, a classic book. Based on a classic book, but also a classic movie. The book that it's based on is called Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad. Awesome book, awesome movie. I had no interest in Vietnam then. I knew nothing of it. The film left me enthralled and fascinated, even a little horrified in an abstract way. I came home agitated, but still had not made any connection. The epiphany came when I walked in the front door. My father was sitting quietly in his recliner, sipping coffee and watching the Cardinals play the Reds on television. My mother sat on the couch crocheting under a lamp, humming a hymn to herself, our Labrador Casey resting on the floor at her feet. I stared at them for a long 20 seconds before my father snapped the spell. Hey, Johnny, he said, come in here and watch the game. Redbirds are up 5-3 in the seventh. Yeah? I moved into the room and turned to face the television. What'd you go see, hon? My mother asked. What? What movie did you see? I lied. I quickly named some comedy that was showing in the same complex. It was awful. I added to cut off the questioning. I saw the movie again a few days later, Apocalypse Now, and I saw it anew. My father was in there somewhere, dug into a bunker behind a wall of foliage, there amid the ragged poor and dripping trees and the sounds of gunfire and explosion. And when I returned home from that movie that night, he was reading a John le Carre novel, sipping coffee, the silky voice of Jack Buck in the background, describing the Cardinals game in Atlanta. The evening was hot and dry. It would be a hard summer of drought in southern Illinois. There's our setting, southern Illinois. So something about this movie Apocalypse Now really piqued Jonathan Allen's interest about his dad's military career. The next day, I walked to the library and borrowed 3 books about the Vietnam War. My summer project would be to learn about the war and my father's place there. Under a hot mid-morning sun, I skimmed the thinnest of the 3 on the way home, anxious as though poised to turn the knob of a mysterious door. At home, I hid 2 of the books in my safest place above the loose tiles of the lowered ceiling in my bedroom, and took the 3rd book and my copy of the Pickwick Papers into the backyard. This reminds me a lot of a college friend that I had who lost his dad at a very young age. His dad had cancer caused by Agent Orange. If you don't know what that is, it's not fun. Maybe I'll talk about it when I come back. But anyway, is an attempt in a way to meet the father that he never really got to know as a young man or as an adult. My friend always had a stack of Vietnam books next to his bed. That's how he got to know his dad. We had a large yard behind the house, enclosed by a fence of pointed wooden slats 5 feet high. Against the back fence stood a terraced flower garden built long before by a previous owner. It ran the length of the fence and was fronted by a red brick wall about 2 feet high. The 3 levels were separated by stacked railroad ties. My parents loved the garden and would labor all summer to keep it lush. Even that summer of drought, as the grass was browning under the merciless sun, my parents kept the garden well watered. From April to September, we had cut flowers on the dinner table every night. I kept a private place in the upper left corner of the garden. It was known to everyone. If I was nowhere to be found, my family could always check to see if I was there reading. Before watering, my parents would always shout a warning lest I be rained on, although known, it was still quiet and just isolated enough. I would lie down on the ground behind a thick wall of daylilies, my back against the fence, and read or think while staring up at the sky. This is where I learned about the Vietnam War. I lay on my side and read for at least 3 hours every day, softly repeating the names of the places and operations, marking pages with thick weeds. If called or found, I would rise from the flowers with the Pickwick Papers in hand, leaving the history book in a plastic bag among the daylilies to be collected later. In the evenings, while listening to baseball games, I transferred notes from the weed-marked pages into a notebook that I kept hidden in my sock and underwear drawer. Within 2 weeks, I had finished those first 3 books. Upon completion of the 3rd, I emerged from the daylilies feeling expert. My knowledge of the war, dates, places, names, had zoomed up from 0. I was ready to ask my mother some questions. I approached her one afternoon before my father had returned from work. She was peeling potatoes over the kitchen sink when I patted in nervously. Mom? Yes, Johnny? Mom, where's Dad stationed in Vietnam? My throat was dry. I never uttered the word to my parents. My mother stopped working and turned to face me, potato peeler held upright in her hand. She looked puzzled. I don't remember, Johnny. Lord, that was over 10 years ago. I don't remember those funny foreign names. He was stationed in more than one place anyway. Why? I felt ashamed, flushed. Just curious. We learned a little about it at school. I was just curious, that's all. I wish I could tell you, but I don't remember. You know me, I have trouble remembering what I did last week. She laughed an unhumorous laugh. Should I ask Dad? She suddenly looked very tired and thoughtful. Oh, Johnny, please don't, she whispered. Don't bring it up with him. It took him so long to forget all that. Don't ask him to start remembering again. And she looked directly at me, and I could see that she was pleading with me. And I thought she was going to cry, but she turned back to the sink and ran her hands and a potato under the tap. She began working again. Okay, Mama, I won't. I'm sorry. Don't be sorry, honey. You have a right to be curious. So my generation, it was like our parents that fought Vietnam. My parents didn't serve in the war, but I had plenty of friends who had parents that did. Um, it's clear that Johnny's dad doesn't want to talk about the war. There's nothing on the walls celebrating his military career. Mom freaks out when Johnny suggests asking him, says, don't. In my personal experience talking with Vietnam vets, I found that either people really want to talk about it or they don't want to talk about it at all, really want to get it off their chest or really don't even want to bring it up. And Johnny's dad seems to be the latter. So the next day I was with Joe. We were returning from the shopping mall in Fairview Heights, 20 miles away. We were in the old pickup truck he used on construction jobs, trying to cool ourselves with the wide open windows, though even the rushing air was warm and uncomfortable. Joe was 18 then and worked nearly every day. I was enjoying the trip all the more because he allowed himself so few days off. We were speeding down an empty 2-lane road through a farmland south of Stone City. It was sickening to see. The corn, usually head high by the end of July, was barely up to my waist. The ground was cracked and broken in places. Some farmers had recently given up. You could see by the dry brown stalks standing packed closely together that they had stopped watering. Sounds familiar. Look at it, Joe said, shaking his head and poking his thumb out the window. He had to shout to be heard over the sound of rushing air. I've never seen anything like this before. Even Grandma says it's the worst she's seen. I nodded and looked around at the dying fields. What'd you buy? He shouted at my and pointing at my bag. I pulled out Great Expectations, Charles Dickens, and showed it to him. He gave it only a half look and a nod. Then he shouted, "What's the other?" Pointing again at the bag. I hesitated and pulled out Dispatches by Michael Hare. Joe grabbed it and began reading the back cover, completely ignoring the road. We began to drift across the center line into oncoming lane. I reached over and gave the wheel a slight pull to the right. Joe looked up and grinned. He continued reading, now flicking his eyes up every few seconds. Vietnam, he shouted. What'd you buy this for? I shrugged. Joe rolled up his window and motioned for me to do the same. The cab was suddenly very quiet. I looked over and watched a red-winged blackbird light upon a fence post. Joe nearly whispered, "What'd you buy this for?" I'm just curious. I've been reading some history on the war. Does Dad know? No. Mom? Only a little, not about my reading. Joe looked down at the road. We were already baking in the closed, quiet cab. Just watch out. Keep it to yourself. He threw the book into my lap. What do you remember about the war? Not much. I remember Dad coming home, hands all screwed up, quiet, but I hadn't seen him in so long that I don't remember him being different or anything. And maybe quieter. I don't know. I was only 7, and I remember the POW MIA sticker. I never understood that until I was in high school. We had the bumper sticker on an old green Impala. You remember? No. Do you know the POW MIA sticker flag? It's the black flag. It's got the silhouette of the head in the middle. You can read what that means and try to derive any conclusions that you will. Well, that's all I remember, really. I never took too much interest. I figured he'd tell us if he wanted to. Weren't you ever curious? No, not too much. It seemed all bad in ancient history. War under the bridge and all that. I got to roll this window down. I considered asking Joe what he thought about my plan, but didn't. I had decided after talking to my mother that I was going to get into the locker boxes, though I had yet to figure out how. My father was in the garden nearly every day after work and saw the boxes while getting tools or the hose. Obviously, I needed the keys. So, in order to find out what happened with his father, he's going to try sneaking the keys and getting into those locker boxes that were mentioned at the beginning of the story, because mom doesn't want to talk about it. Dad doesn't want to talk about it. Joe seems pretty limited. So Johnny has decided that his only option is to dig into these locker boxes and figure it out for himself. I examined the boxes the next morning. They were stacked in a corner next to a small work table. Coffee cans full of paintbrushes and nails and loose nuts and bolts stood on top of them. As far as I knew, they hadn't been opened in 6 years. Spider webs were constructed with a confident permanence between the sides of the boxes and the shed wall. I gave a cursory tug at the 3 locks, each of which had been scratched with a number. The locks were the common hardware store variety that always come with 2 keys. I began searching for the extras in the drawers and in the tool shed. In the days that followed, I rummaged through boxes, cleaned the attic over the garage. I carefully went through my father's dresser with no luck. I did find 1 loose key at the bottom of a toolbox and raced out to the shed to try it, but it wouldn't even slide into the core of the locks. I would have to take the risky route for the operation. The useless old key would help. I spent 3 scorching days in the garden reading dispatches and an oral history of the war while I looked for the courage necessary to put the plan into effect. The plan was simple, but I wasn't certain it was safe. I would switch the old key I had found for the one on the key ring, rummage a box, and switch the key for a second the following day, and then switch the one after that for a 3-day operation. So his plan is to go and take the keys, which he knows are on Dad's key ring, and replace them with this extra key each day and examine 1 box a day to try to figure out his dad's military legacy. And we will get to the rest of that in part 2 on schools tomorrow. Yeah, I believe how it works. And next time you're in this class, we'll be checking out the rest of this story and see how the operation goes and see what Johnny learns about the whole scenario. So without further ado, thank you for joining me. Make sure you treat your substitute kindly, and we'll see you on the flip side.